We'll give everybody like one more minute to get settled in here because I know it's the top of the hour, and then we will get started for real. Thank you all for being here. This is great. I am flying a little bit blind, so I'm not really able to see who's here unless you do check in the chat. So if you want to check in the chat and say hi, it would be fun to see your names, to see who actually is here. So let me know. I'm sure there are a lot of former students of Ollie's and I, maybe some clients of ours, maybe some people that just found us through YouTube or a blog post. So regardless of how you found us, thank you for being here. Okay. Cool. Well, why don't we get started for real? So I'll start with a little introduction of what we're doing here over the course of the next hour and a little introduction of myself. So this is the Tableau Order of Operations webinar. I would say if I was going to add a word to this, which we were trying not to kind of keep the title a little more concise, you could probably put the word filtering in here. So if you want to call this the Tableau Filtering Order of Operations webinar, that would probably be pretty appropriate. So we're going to be looking at just how does Tableau interpret all these different steps that you take, everything from adding an input filter or a data source filter, writing different forms of calculations. Why do fixed expressions sometimes not return what you think they should? All sorts of things like that. So we're so excited to be able to cover that with you. For those that I haven't met before, because I know there are some new folks on the call that maybe they've kind of followed along on the channel for a little bit, but we haven't had a chance to meet in a live environment like this. So my name is Eric Parker. I am based in the Seattle area. Born and raised here. I started using Tableau in 2013 when it was kind of, the hot thing on the street. People were like, I haven't heard of this. Let me check this thing out. I became a trainer almost immediately and started to hit the road teaching Tableau classes on Tableau's behalf as a partner of theirs. In 2016, my colleague Kirk, who is here on the call somewhere, he and I co-founded OneNumber, and then Ollie, who a lot of you have got to know through our videos, joined us a few years later. I'm officially a Tableau ambassador now, for what that's worth. So huge shout out to you all, because you're a big reason why that happened. The fact that you're here and you follow us and you find our content helpful and you share it with others. And I haven't really done an exact count in a while, but especially between Ollie and I, we've got several hundred different Tableau resources out there now. So if you ever have questions, we're happy to try and point you in the right direction with blogs and videos that we've done. A little bit about me personally, when I'm not just, 9 to 5 working on data. My wife and I have a couple of young boys. They're 2 and 4. I've got an overly energetic dog. I like to root for the Seattle Mariners. I was just there on Sunday to see their first home playoff win in 24 years. Thank goodness for that. And my hobby, the one hobby I somewhat keep up with, is metal detecting. So I know I'm probably about 40 years too young for that, but I do enjoy it. Got into it as a kid and just sort of kept it around and kept doing it a bit. So I'm actually going to the East Coast next week to do some metal detecting, which will be fun. All right. So one of the main things that we are going to be referring to throughout the course of this webinar is this order of operations diagram. Now, this is from Tableau's website. If you've downloaded the workbook, there is a link there to where it came from. If you just Google Tableau order of operations, it'll be one of the first things that comes up. This is really helpful. Tableau's updated this a little bit over the years, but this is going to be a bit of a guide for us over the next hour. And we're going to talk through, like, what are all these things? You might be looking at this and thinking, like, what is a table calculation filter and why should I care about that, right? I feel like I used Tableau for a few years before I really kind of figured out what that was. So just seeing some chats, a couple practical notes here. Yes, we are recording this. We're going to figure out a way to distribute it afterwards. And we're going to distribute a bunch of additional resources as well, like a supplementary blog post, things that maybe go deeper on specific topics. So stay tuned for that. We're hoping to have that out either later this week or next week, just depending on how long it takes to process all of this. So you will be getting a bunch of additional resources, but you hopefully have an email from me earlier this morning with where you can download a copy of the workbook that I'm going through. If you can't find that, let us know in the chat, and Ollie and Kirk can help you out there. Okay, so all that said, let's take it from the top and speak to extract and data source filters as our first couple of steps. So an extract filter, where you would find this is actually back in your data source tab. Typically, I guess you could create an extract from the data pane in a worksheet, but a lot of times you'll go back to your data source, and when you generate an extract in Tableau, you have the option to apply a filter to it. So maybe we should take a step back and just say, like, what is an extract, right? Because you might be looking at that and just thinking, I need a little explanation on that. So an extract is where Tableau takes your data, whether it's in a file like Excel, whether it's in a database table like SQL, it will take that table and it will create a local optimized copy of it that can be used in Tableau. And Tableau creates what's called an extract file, or the extension is .hyper. And so that's a really ideal way a lot of times to store your data so that Tableau can process against it very quickly. And then one of the things that makes the extract most efficient is by adding an extract filter, right? Which is saying, hey, maybe your original data set is 5 million rows of data, but you really only need data from the last couple of years. So you're going to add an extract filter to say, only keep data from 2024 and 2025. So now you've gone from 5 million records down to 2 million records, right? So your data source is effectively now just 2 million records after those filters, right? So that's the number one reason that people use extract filters, I would say, is to decrease the size of your data source and improve processing speed. And then the other thing is maybe for security's sake, right? There might be rows of data that aren't appropriate for a lot of people to be able to see. So maybe you just say, hey, we're going to filter that data out anytime that the org group is human resources, something like that, right? So let's actually look at how you set one of these up, because that's part of what we're here to do, is not only talk about this, but go through one or two practical examples for each of these steps. So I will pop back to the data source tab. I honestly don't remember if my my data sources are extracts. Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was like, I think they had to be extracts to publish this to Tableau Public. So let me go back to a live connection on my Superstore data source. If you do this, it's probably going to challenge you and say, like, where is Superstore? And it is just the copy of Superstore I'm using is in my Tableau repository. So if you go to data sources, if you go to your documents folder, my Tableau repository, there might be a couple subfolders about what version it is or something, and then eventually data sources, you'll find a data source called Superstore. This is not something you really need to click and follow along with. I'm just telling you that in case you really want to, or maybe you're coming back to this later and you want to see that. But honestly, most versions of Superstore should work fine for this. And then, I saw a question there about world indicators. Same thing. World indicators data source will also be in the My Tableau documents, My Tableau repository, whatever subfolders, and then data source. Yeah. All right. So if I'm working with this data source, I'm not really going to do anything too custom to this, but let's say I go, you know what? I really don't need data from 3 years ago. So if I just keep data from the last 3 years, but not before that, I'm going to be in good shape. So I select extract. I think this actually just went back onto the extract that it created previously. If there wasn't an extract already, then when I tried to navigate to a worksheet or a dashboard, it would prompt me and be like, do you want to create this extract now? But let me do this. Since I do already have an extract, then what I need to do is to select edit. And that pulls up this dialog box here. Okay. And the section that we're focused on right now is just filters. There are a lot of other options here. I'm going to make a note to myself to send you a resource on extracts and goes into more detail on those, because I do think that's a really important topic to master. But I don't mean for this whole conversation to become about extracts necessarily. So I'm going to hit the filter dropdown, add a filter, and then you can choose either any field here, or actually if you write a calculation, you oftentimes have the option to choose it here as well. So sometimes if you need something kind of complex, if you're like, oh, it could be 2025 for order date or ship date, how do I do that? You could write a calculation and then come back and reference the calculation in the filter. Again, more complex than we're doing this moment. Just wanted to point that out. So if I pick order date, from my list. It gives me some options here. So maybe I go into years, select next, and I'm just going to say, you know what? I don't really need to see 2021 for the sake of what I'm doing. So I'm going to select 2021, choose to exclude that row of data. So now it's going to keep 2022 through 2025. The other benefit of doing an exclusionary filter like this is I don't have to come back here in 2026 and make a new selection, right? A lot of times I'll see people do this. They'll be like, I just need 2023 through 2025. Okay, create the extract, I'm done. Well, what happens in January next year? 2026 shows up and it's not selected, right? And so they'd like, basically what happens is there's a day or two where everybody's running around chasing their tails like, the data source isn't updating, red alert. And then it's only after the fact and some troubleshooting when you're like, right, it's because we had this filter. So I'm a proponent of, hey, if 2021, 2022, whatever you don't need, exclude that, say okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and select Save Settings. I think it already generated it. These should be pretty fast extracts because this data source is just like a 10,000 row Excel file. But then we're good to go. So let me pop back over to my extract filters image here. It may actually generate the extract now. Let's see. No, it appears it already did it. Okay, good. So like I said, there's a couple different ways of getting to the extract dialog box, but ultimately the filtering will work the same. And if you're in an older version of Tableau, that dialog box may look just a little bit different, but the functionality and the ability to do extract filters is the same. Okay. So like I said, basically there, I don't know how many rows. Let's say we cut out 2,000 rows out of 10,000. So that's not going to make a huge difference in relative terms with this data source. But again, if you're talking about, let's say hundreds of thousands or millions, that's where you're going to see a big benefit. And then same vibe, right? If you say, hey, I want to filter out the human resources org because I don't need people throughout our company seeing information on that, you can add a filter for that. So there you go. That's a little bit on extract filters. Okay. If you have questions as we're going, feel free to pop those in the chat. How I'm planning to do that is we will take questions at the end of the webinar. I'm also going to sort of have an intermission in the middle, and that may be a good place to address some of the questions before we like move too far past a category, right? If you're like, I have an extract filter question and I don't want to wait 40 minutes, that'll be a nice time to be able to address that. Okay. Great. Okay, so let's pop forward to data source filters. Okay, so data source filters is just the next step after extract filters. In some old versions of this order of operations dialog, or image, I should say, if you've been around the Tableau world for a while, you may have seen them kind of confusingly at the same level. And I am glad that they have broken them up now and show that data source filters happen after extract filters. And let me explain why. Okay. So where you would add a data source filter, it's in a very similar place to the extract, right? With the extract, we would add that and we edited it and we added an extract filter here. Okay. But with data source filters, we actually add those over here. Okay. So then you might be looking at that and saying, okay, well, what's the difference? They seem like they're in the same place and they do roughly the same thing. Why would I use one or the other? Great question. Okay, so first of all, I would say that data source filters, I would more commonly use those for a live data source versus an extract. You might hear that and think, well, what do you mean by that? Okay, let's say I've connected to a Microsoft SQL Server database and I've set up a relationship across 5 or 10 different tables. It doesn't really make sense to extract the data source because it would be really massive or just impractical for some reason. So I'm just relying on Tableau's relationship data modeling, but I do want some filters, right? I say, hey, actually, I only want to show data from the last couple years, or I only want to show it for the West region, or fill in the blank, right? That's one of the places where data source filters can be so handy because you can use them against live data sources, right? So let's pop back to our data source tab. Maybe for this one, I'll use world indicators, just so that we're not messing with that same extract that we just did with Superstore. So let me hit this drop down here, just this little cylinder right here, and I'm going to flip over to the world indicators data source. So that's also an extract, and that's just because I had to extract these to publish it to Tableau Public for you. But regardless, it could be an extract, it could be live. Let's go add a data source filter. So I click on this add button up here in the top right and hit this add button here. And then honestly, very similar to when we added the extract filter, we get to choose what are we trying to filter on. So for this case, let's say, once again, I'll pick year. It's a sort of easy one to understand. So we'll select year and say, okay. I'll select years because year is a date field. And then once again, let's say I just want to exclude, let's say I exclude the first few years, 2000, 2001, 2002. Let's go ahead and exclude those. Yeah. So we say, okay. And okay, actually, this is a very important distinction that you may or may not have, depending on what version of Tableau that you're in. I want to say it was either just this year in the 2025 series or maybe in the late 2024 series of Tableau. You actually have the ability now with a data source filter to decide, is it just applying to the table that the field came from, or is it applying to all related tables as well? Which is sort of an interesting distinction, right? Because to maybe compare and contrast that to extracts, Tableau just looks at it as an extract as like a single entity. And it's just like, hey, if you filter out whatever, 2021, it's gone from the entire extract. Whereas here, you could say like, if I had some other related table of data, I could say, do I want this where I'm filtering out the years? Should that just apply to this table, or should it apply to any other table that I may connect it to as well? So that's a really important piece of functionality that Tableau's just recently added. Again, for like relationships, when you're setting up all these connections between these tables, that can be really beneficial because then you could say, actually, there's like this one table that goes back to 2003, but the other ones don't really. So I just want to apply this filter to that, one table. Can be really handy for that, right? And actually where I've found that most practical is when you have tables with multiple versions. So for example, I was working with like a community college system, and they had what they call the department table. Well, departments would get renamed or reorged. So what was the human resources department became the people department. So what I needed to do is to add a filter to say, basically only keep the current record for each department. But I only needed that to apply to the department table. It didn't really need to like filter out anything from other tables. So I would just say like, yes, this should only apply here. Okay. If you're ever in doubt, feel free just to go with the default option and then come back and tinker with it if that doesn't work for you. But it is just nice to have that option. And actually, we've actually done a video on this recently. I'm going to write this down as well. So we'll include that in the resource list that'll be with this video when we publish it. Okay. So I say, okay, and now I have a data source filter, right? Okay, so one thing to be careful of with extract or data source filters is there's really kind of nowhere in Tableau's main interface that it tells you that you've applied one of these. You would actually need to come back here typically to data source and check this listing here for data source filters, or check the extract to see if any filters have been applied. Sometimes it's kind of obvious because you'll be like, I know this data exists and I don't see it anywhere and I haven't applied any filters. But I do see a lot of people get tripped up with that if they're either not too familiar with these, or oftentimes it's when somebody inherits somebody else's workbook and then they'll be like, why am I not seeing this data? I know it should be here. So definitely be careful about those. And if you ever don't see data you think you should, especially if you didn't make the data source, come back and check it. Okay, so that's a little bit about setting up a data source filter, but I want to cover off on a couple other important distinctions. So I sort of learned about data source filters the hard way. I guess I assumed that if you had an extract and a data source filter, that your data source would actually be smaller, but it's not the case. So if you have I'll actually give you a real world example. So I was working with a very large tech company and working with their HR data. And basically the combination of everything we set up ended up becoming like 100 million rows, because it was like all job postings and interviews and candidates and anything ever. And So we need to filter it down. So I was like, well, here, let's set up an extract and then add a data source filter to just keep data from like this year. We still needed prior years sometimes for lookups and stuff. So we didn't want to get rid of it entirely, but we're like, let's just add a data source filter. I'm thinking this is going to make this thing faster because the extract refreshes were failing on their server. It did not help. And I was like, wait, I thought this will make this smaller. No, what a data source filter does is for an extract, it filters it after the extract has been created. So if you want your extract to actually be smaller, if you want it to go from 100 million rows to 10 million rows, you need to add an extract filter, not a data source filter. The data source limits what the user can see, but it doesn't actually make, especially an extracted data source, smaller. A live data source, sure, but not an extract. I hope that was at least somewhat clear the way I described that. Like I said, I'll send a resource that goes into some detail on that as well. But if you want an extract to be small, use an extract filter. Okay. Another primary use case for data source filters would be user or group level filtering. I don't really have this set up to do that, but I'm happy to explain how that would work. So a lot of times, if you're working with sensitive data, hey, maybe salespeople that work in the West region should only see data related to the West region, and those that are working in the East region should only see data from the East region, right? So you could actually go back and in your data source filters, you could add something like this. So I don't actually have like a user name filter or an email field or something like that, but I'll just pretend I do. So pretend that region is email, for example. So what you could do is you could say something like, I'm going to set a conditional filter and I'm going to say the username from Tableau server is equal to my email field or my alias field, right? So this is not going to work because I don't actually have a field called alias, but this is a sort of a simplified version of what Tableau calls a row level security, right? So for example, I come in here, all the rows of data from the West region, there's a column associated with that says alias Eric.Parker. So when I log in, it auto filters down to just the data from the West region. But when Kirk logs in, all the rows from the East region have an alias field that says Kirk.Olson. So when he logs in, it auto filters to the East region and he can't see my region, the West region. So that's a really practical use case of a data source filter, is just limiting what data is visible to your user. An advanced version of that would be this function called isMemberOf. Okay, so if you ever set up groups on Tableau server, right, you might say these people are in the marketing group and these people are in the sales group and these people are in the human resources group. Then you can actually set up rules and say, hey, only people that are part of this group can see, these dashboards or, data related to this org. So there's some pretty advanced things you can do with data source filter that are helpful when you're trying to set up user level filtering. All right, so it's mad at me because that doesn't exist. I don't care. I wasn't actually trying to set that up. Just wanted to explain that. Okay, cool. So those are a few ideas around data source filters. I use both of these. Again, a little bit different use cases, so it's not like you have to choose one or the other. It probably depends on, are you using an extract? Are you using a live data source? Do you want to make that extract smaller? Do you want to filter the users that can see your views, right? Those are the kinds of questions that would lead you down one path or the other. And sometimes you end up doing both to the same data source. Yeah, I see a question there about, is the live connection more useful when data is added every day? It's an interesting question. So with an extract, right, an extract is a snapshot of data at the point or the time of extract creation. So you can schedule an extract to refresh pretty often, every day, every hour, maybe even every 15 minutes, depending on how long it takes to generate. You can also set up what are called incremental extract refreshes. So it just adds new rows of data to the bottom of the existing extract rather than like regenerating the entire thing. And a lot of times people use those together. They'll be like incremental every 30 minutes, but a full refresh every night, just in case any historical rows of data changed. So there's sort of some different options available to you. But yeah, the live connection, I mean, that's handy if you have a data source where being live really is important, or historical records are changed frequently. Those are a couple times you might be more likely to use that. Yeah, cool. Okay, Next up on the list would be top filters. I cannot tell you what a headache these gave me the first time that I used them and didn't understand what was happening. So a top filter in Tableau happens right here in the order of operations. And just before a top filter, you have context filters. And just afterwards, you have dimension filters. Okay, so let's talk about this. I've got sort of a preset bar chart here that's going to help us. So what I'm looking at here is some Superstore data, and we're just looking at what are our top 10 selling products all time. No filters on this worksheet whatsoever, okay? So let's say I want to just filter down to just my top 10, right? What are my top 10 selling products? Easy enough, right? So kind of the default way of doing that would be we get a copy of product name from the data source, or from the data pane, I should say. We put that on filters. From here, we navigate to the top tab, and we select by field. Actually, this is kind of beautiful. The default is exactly what we would want. Top 10 by sum of sales. Let's do it. So we do this, we say okay, and it works. It does exactly, I think, what we all envisioned it would do, right? It shows us our top 10 selling products. If you ever want just like to quickly count the number of data points in your sheet, by the way, the best way to do that is just to use the little status bar at the bottom. So Tableau is just telling me there's 10 rows or 10 bars in this data source, or in this worksheet rather. So cool. Okay. Well, what happens if I add another filter, right? Let's say I want to see my top 10 selling furniture products. Then what? So I grab category from the data pane. I put this on filters, and I choose furniture. And we're not seeing 10 anymore, right? Now we're seeing 2. Let's go back and check our product name filter. Go back to the top tab. I mean, yeah, it's definitely still just says top 10 sum of sales. So what's happening? Well, even though I put the top 10 on first and then category on second, the reality is the order that you add your filters, or the order that they're listed in the filters card, doesn't really override Tableau's order of operations, right? So if I go back here, let's say we started with 1,000 possible products, right? So the way that Tableau works by default is the fact that I have a top 10 filter at all. It goes, okay, you want to filter this down to the top 10? You got it. And then it's after the fact that that top 10 hit the dimension filter, which was category equals furniture. And then it goes, okay, now you're down to just 2 products, right? Again, doesn't matter what order I put those filters in. That's the way that Tableau's reading it. The top filter happens first. What I really want to have happen though is like this. Let me get my little annotation tool on here again. All right. So if I have my 1,000 products, if it hits the category filter, filter that down first, right? If I've selected an individual category, let's say I select furniture. Okay, there's 300 furniture products. It's now filtered down to that. Then it hits the top filter, and then that takes it down to the top 10. So how do we make sure that category, furniture, gets processed before top 10? We take the category filter and we turn it into a context filter. So we're basically just going to take a dimension filter and bump it up Tableau's order of operations to become a context filter. Okay, so back to our worksheet here. It's actually simpler than you think. If you haven't done this, you just go to category furniture, hit my drop down. I say add to context. And my visual cue now is that pill that used to be blue, because it's a dimension, it's now gray, meaning that it's a context filter. And a lot of times, like, people that maybe aren't that familiar with this will ask me like, well, does that have like performance issues or other limitations? Not really. If I show this filter, my end user can still use this just the same as any other filter. They don't know the difference, right? We're just kind of maneuvering behind the scenes to get this to do what we want. And then as far as performance is concerned, I mean, you always want to test things when you're adding a lot of different types of filters. But I would say like adding a single field to context like this, generally you're not going to see, a noticeable performance dip versus, not having one on context. If you want, you can even add multiple fields to context. So then there kind of becomes a whole nother conversation around that, which we're probably not going to go too deep into just now. But this is great because now we're ensuring that the category filter is processed before our top 10. And we can still get that original view by just selecting all categories, right? Now we're back to the overall top 10. So what I might want to do here is maybe just add a subtitle that would just say like what category is actually selected. So I just double clicked on my worksheet title. I'm going to insert category there. So right now all categories are selected, but if I select furniture, this is just a good clarification for my end user that like, hey, we're talking about the top 10 furniture products right now. All right. One more pretty related topic that we'll hit just now before our intermission are fixed expressions or level of detail expressions, right? So kind of in the same general area that we found our top filters, we also find our fixed expressions, right? We've hit on fixed expressions a bit recently on our channel, so hopefully you've had a chance to see those. If not, I think it was actually maybe even just last week's video where Ollie hit on 5 practical use cases of level of detail expressions. We have some other videos as well. We'll link those in the resources that'll go along with this webinar recording. But with fixed expressions, you can actually run into a very similar sort of issue that we just ran into with our top filter. Okay, so let's look at a reason you might use a fixed expression and then where it might kind of get you in trouble. So this is 100% a total stacked bar chart. We use these a fair amount to sort of help people understand distribution of data. So in this case, it's like, hey, what region did the most sales come from for each of these subcategories, right? And if I just wanted to add a little header here that would say like phones had $300,000 in sales, but fasteners only had $5,000 in sales. How do I do that? Well, you might just say, well, put the sales field on rows and make it discrete so it shows up as a label, right? Which, okay, you could try that, but here's the problem. If I throw sales on rows and flip it to discrete, right? Here's a little Spark note for you. Continuous means a measure is going to be plotted against an axis, at least if it's on rows or columns. Discrete means it's going to show up as a header or a label. Okay. So if I try and make this discrete, it doesn't look very good, right? So what's going on? Let me change my worksheet view to fit with for a moment. So Tableau looks at this data source, or this worksheet rather, and it says there are 17 subcategories and 4 regions. So the cardinality of this data source is there are 68 unique data points, 68 unique marks. So it's giving us 68 individual labels, which is not what we want, right? We're like, no, Tableau, don't give us 68 labels. I just want 17 labels, just one for each subcategory. So there are several ways of doing this. You don't have to use the level of detail expression for those that want to nitpick, but let's say you choose to use a level of detail expression, specifically a fixed function, right? So if I go here and if I say, hey, I'm going to fix this on subcategory and return my sum of sales. Let me zoom in on that so you can see it. All right, what this would do is it would, even though region is in the view, Tableau is going to effectively ignore it for the sake of how it's aggregating sum of sales with this calculation, right? This is basically us creating a little miniature table behind the scenes where we tell Tableau, hey, I just want you to create a little table with 17 values. And those 17 values is sum of sales for each subcategory, okay? If you haven't used these a lot, if you ever need to do like 2 different fields, right? If you're like, hey, actually I need this for subcategory and for customer segment. Well, we don't have segment here. Is it just segment? There it is. You can always comma delimit them. Okay, again, I don't mean for this to become a whole level of detail conversation. Exactly, we've done a webinar on that. We could do a whole nother one again if y'all want. But for now, we'll just leave this as is. We say okay. Let me just format it nice. So I'm going to right click on sales amount in my data pane. Go to number format. Go to currency custom. No decimals. Now I pull sales amount onto rows. Right click, set it to discrete again, like we tried to do earlier. And now we're in pretty good shape here, right? So let me hit the drop down and set it to entire view again, just to give this whole chart a little bit more breathing room. Okay, And there we go. We've got this nice header value that just tells us the sales value for each of these subcategories, which is actually really important context in this chart because you've got phones with $250,000 in sales and fasteners with $2,000 in sales. So there's a pretty big difference. Okay, why did we just go to all these lengths? Well, the whole point was fixed expressions happen before dimension filters. So what does that mean? Well, if I go over here now, and if I add any old filter, right? If I add, let's say, segment, customer segment. Okay, lock this number in your brain. Phones, $244,000 in sales, right? Presumably, if I filter this down to, let's say, just our corporate customers, this number should go down, right? I mean, I guess there's always a very small chance that all of those phone sales are corporate, but they're not. So I do this, I say, okay, and it went down like ever so slightly, actually. So I must have cut off a couple of rows of data in doing that, but it only went down $1,000. Is that correct? Some of them didn't change at all. Storage stayed at $169,000. Is that correct? It seems like it should go down more than like not at all, or like maybe a percentage point. So what's happening there? Well, again, the fixed expression calculates before a dimension filter. So I suppose if we like absolutely kicked a customer out of the view with our filter, their data dropped off. But I have a hunch, and let's actually just go feel this out on another worksheet. If I got subcategory and I got segment and I put sales on here, let's go find phones. That was our use case. Phones, well, we were doing corporate, I think, right? Corporate phone sales is $65,000 total, not $243,000. So, okay, what's going on? If I want this filter segment to execute before the fixed expression where it's coming up with these sort of, pre-coded values, I need to hit the drop down and also add this to context. So watch this. Phones is at, actually phones I don't think changed. I'm sorry. I misspoke earlier. I thought it changed because I saw 243. I think it's sorting based on, actually, I don't know what it's sorting on. I think I sorted it on some sort of sales dollars earlier. So actually phones didn't change at all. It's still at 244,000. So, okay. If I hit this drop down now and add it to context, we see phones drop from 244,000 down to just 65,000 because corporate phone sales is $65,000. Right? And that actually ties out to what we just saw over here. Wait, I'm in paper. These subcategories have got me turned around. There we go. Phones, corporate, $65,000. Bingo. We got it, right? Okay, cool. So I just wanted to point this out because very commonly when I create fixed expressions in Tableau and I use them in a worksheet, it's pretty common that there are filters that I want to apply that would update the values that the fixed expression is creating. If those filters are not on context, the fixed expression values will not recalculate based on that updated filter context. Okay. Again, this is kind of the Spark Notes version of this. We actually have a whole nother full video that goes into exactly just this question and this topic of fixed expressions and context filters. So broken record here. We'll link that in the resources when we send out this recording. But I hope even just seeing this in general is helpful. Maybe you've run into this where you're like, my stupid fixed function doesn't work right when I filter. It's actually kind of working as it is supposed to, but you just have to kind of understand, okay, where does this fall in Tableau's order of operations? Okay, we're at roughly the halfway point. Realistically, we're probably at like the 2/3 point, but I wanted to do like a brief intermission here for a couple of things. I know maybe not all of you will be able to be here till the very end. So if you're not able to, we are working on getting a recording out either later this week or early next week with some additional resources. If you have any questions for me directly, feel free to email me. I can get back to you, outside of this time. I'm not checking my email while I'm doing this. That would be too distracting. And then just in general, like what we do at OneNumber, if you're like, I've never actually been to any of your things before. So yes, we do like tons of free blog posts and YouTube videos, and we hope that's really helpful to the community. We don't get paid to do that. How do we get paid? Well, we get to help you solve your problems, right? So that could be anything from troubleshooting some sort of issue you're dealing with, helping you with some design updates, mentorship, helping you build your dashboards from idea to data model to dashboards, review, iterate. We teach a number of different Tableau classes. So if you ever have like needs or questions, whether it's for you personally or for your team, let us know. We'd love to chat with you about that. Okay. And I'm also just going to take this as a moment to just look through the chat and any questions that have come up on those first few sections, and then we will tackle a few more. And we'll have another time for questions at the end. So feel free to be writing those up ahead of time if you want to get prepared. Cool. Yeah, I see a couple of chats there. One of them is about how to handle multiple context filters in a worksheet. So if we have time at the end, we could do that. There was another request for another level of detail webinar. To be fair, the previous one we did was probably 4 or 5 years ago. So it might be time for an update on that. So, okay, cool. Thanks. All right, let's dive into set filters. Okay. So sets also, once again, happen roughly in the same area as top and fixed in Tableau's order of operations. And I think the important thing to know here is that they happen before dimension filters. Okay. So I'm going to show you my number one use case for set filters. It's not all that exciting or sexy, but it is very practical. Okay. So let's say you've got, a dimension that you're using in your worksheet, whether it's visible or it's just as a filter, and it has a null value, right? And you're like, I hate having this null value that my user could select, and they're very confused about it, and it always defaults to the top, and like, how do I get rid of this thing, right? So notice that like null country is showing up at the top, but even if you were like exclude it or something, that becomes a little bit of a problem if you ever want to give your user the ability to filter. Thank you, Microsoft. If you ever want to give your user the ability to filter on country, if I right click and show this filter now, it's just showing like null with a slash through it, right? And even if I did something else, right? Even if I was like, okay, don't make this an exclusionary filter, make it include, and just have null deselected, like my user is still going to see that as the first line item in the country filter when they look at it, which is not that great. So if there's no valuable data associated with that null record, and I just want it out of there for the sake of this worksheet, the best way to do that is to pre-filter it with a set. So what do I mean? Okay, so let me go down to my country field in my data pane. Okay, so a little confusing here. I'm just using the one that's just country, not country/region. I'm going to right click on that country field and say create set. Okay, so first of all, if you're like, I haven't really worked with sets a lot, like what actually are sets? These are selectable lists of values. You can preset them. You can show them to your user. You can set up actions in Tableau's background so that certain actions that they take, like they select a bar, it updates the set. There's all sorts of crazy things that you can do with sets. They're worth your time to learn. When you get to the point where you're like, okay, I've mastered the basics. Let me work into some intermediate and advanced stuff. We're going to use sets in a really basic way here, which is I'm just going to call this country set, no nulls. And all I'm going to do here is select null and exclude it. That's it, right? Every one of my other 200 plus countries is going to be included in the set. So if I say, okay, I now have a new variable in my data pane called country set, no nulls. And I want you to watch this. I'm going to drag and drop that set onto the filters card, and I want you to watch this section right here of my country filter. Okay, so I take my set, I drag, I drop it to the filters card. Let's go, right? That null value for country is gone. Why is it gone? Okay, so back to this, the set gets processed before a dimension filter. So I have now effectively pre-filtered that null out of this worksheet by simply creating that set that gets rid of the null and then dropping it on filters. Okay, so like I said, it doesn't have to be that complicated to be practical and helpful. I use this probably more than I care to admit. This can also just be helpful if you just want to sort of pre-curate a list in general. this is going to be kind of silly, but let's say I'm like, hey, yeah, I want them to have these options for these countries, but I want it to be limited to a list of countries that I care about, right? So you could always just do something like that too. Like I'll create a set and I'll just call it country set, my list. There's going to be really no rhyme or reason to this. I'll just grab everything A through L. So I do that. I say, okay. I put that on filters. And now this list will not go past the country starting with the letter L. So you might look at that and say, okay, well, what's a practical use case of that? So many. Like one would just be kind of limiting the number of years that a user could select from. If I'm like, hey, I really only want them to have the option to pick 2022 through 2025, let's limit the other options. Maybe I want to filter out some old or bad data, some orgs that aren't applicable anymore. Those are different ways that you could do that. Okay, so there you go. That's a few minutes on set filters. Yeah, I do see a few questions coming through, and I will come back to those at the end. That's probably the easiest way for me to do this, just to make sure we get the last few topics in here. Okay, one of my favorite, most underrated topics when it comes to Tableau's order of operations, table calculation filters. So you will see that table calculations themselves process before table calculation filters. In fact, table calculation filters happen so late in Tableau's order of operations. A lot of times I will describe them as hiding your data rather than filtering it out. It technically is still a filter, but the reason that I say that is because everything else gets to process first, and then you're just removing something from the view at the very end, even though it can still be practically referenced for the sake of things like calculations. So let's look at a couple examples of that. Okay, first up on my list, I've got the 2012 population of every country in the world. Let me grab a copy of that field, population total, from my data pane and put that on label in the marks card. All right, so at least as of 13 years ago now, take it up with Tableau to update world indicators, not me. I'm not in charge of this data source. We could use some new data though. That would be nice. All right, we got 1.3 million people in China, 1.2 in India. I think that's actually flip-flop now. Regardless, let's set that to be a percent of total. So that population total that's on label in the marks card, I hit the drop down, and we only have one dimension here, so this should be pretty straightforward. I'm just going to use the quick table calculation and set this to be a percent of total. All right. So now, instead of showing the original count or population count, it's showing a percentage, right? Because we just created a table calculation on the fly. That little white triangle at the end of the field in the marks card, that's our visual cue that this is now a table calculation. A table calculation is Tableau taking your original data and then applying, some what Tableau calls a table calculation formula to it to do something else, like calculate a percent of total or a percent difference or a running sum or some way that one mark in the worksheet is being compared against the others and then doing what you ask. So the actual formula is not that important, like how Tableau wrote this. What is important is to understand table calculations and their relationship to different types of filters, right? So table calculations happen after dimension filters, but before table calculation filters. Okay, so you think, so what? Well, how does that impact me? What do I care, right? That's what we're all here asking. What does that matter to me? Okay, well, watch this. So China makes up 19% of the world's population, according to this data set, right? I filter down to region. Oh, it's already on filters, rather. Okay, so it's already here. I'm going to just keep Asia. China has gone from 19% of the world population up to 34%. How did that happen? Well, it's not, it didn't lock in on the world population as the denominator. It's only the data that's in the view, because region is just a normal dimension filter. So what this is actually telling me is China makes up 34% of the population of all countries in Asia, even though they make up 19% of the world population. So you might look at that and say, for some specific use case of yours, I don't want the percentages to change when I change the filter. Okay, well then you would need to think of a way to filter with a table calculation filter rather than a standard filter, and that would keep those percentages intact. Let me show you a couple ways of doing that, okay? Let me rename this to like, I'll call this table calculations example 1, because I'm going to do this 2 different ways. So option 1, this is not going to be exactly what we just did, but I just want to show you this. I'm going to control drag a copy of my percent of total table calculation from label to the filters card. So when I say control drag, I'm holding down the control key. I drag and drop that up on the filters. The control drag leaves the original copy intact on the marks card and then puts an extra copy on the filters card. So I will say, only show me countries that make up at least 1% of world population. If I do this, check that out. It filtered my view. I went from 200 countries down to 18, but you can see China did not recalculate. It's still 19%. Why? This is a table calculation filter. Okay, so this is, again, the table calculation filter processes at the very, very end, even after table calculations have been computed. So when I said just keep those that are 1% or higher, it didn't recalculate those percentages based on the remaining data in the view. It's as if the other 200 odd countries are hidden rather than filtered out. That's why people will say like, oh, this is almost like you're hiding data. Okay, I'm going to give you the complex example here, and we're not going to have a lot of time to break it down, but I do want to show you this so you know this is possible. So you might look at that and say, all right, that was a cheap trick. You filtered on percentage, but you didn't go back to the original thing you did where you filtered on region. Fair. So let me show you how you could filter on region without it impacting those percentages. We're going to turn region into a table calculation, okay? So we're going to use a little old school hack here with the lookup function. So I'm going to say lookup max region 0. This is my new calculation. What the heck is this? Okay, so first of all, lookup is one of a number of table calculation functions. Traditionally, what lookup is used for, where is it? I overshot it. There it is. It's right at the top. Traditionally, what lookup is used for is to calculate the difference from one data point to the next. So you might say, take the sum of sales and look up -1 sum of sales. What's the difference? So when you ask Tableau to create something like a difference table calculation or a percent difference table calculation, it's using lookup behind the scenes. So what I'm telling Tableau is to look up region. Why max region? Well, all table calculations require referenced variables to be aggregated. So you could do min region or max region, it doesn't matter. But if I just said region without an aggregation, Tableau would be like, what are you doing? You need to reference an aggregated value. So I'm just saying look up max region 0. What the heck is that? So China, it would go, hey, what's the maximum region of, so because it's 0 and not 1 or -1, it's not going up or down a point. It's just on that data point. So this basically says, hey, what is the max region of China? It's Asia. What's the max region of India? It's Asia. What's the max region of the United States? The Americas. So in using this, I can throw this on filters, and if I just choose Asia from here, okay, now let me show my lookup filter. China hung in there at 19%. It did not recalculate. Whereas with a traditional dimension filter, it does recalculate. It goes up to 34%. Okay, so like I said, that's a little bit of a trick. It's not something we have a ton of time to dig into just now. I'll send a resource that talks about that. I think one very important thing for me to point out about table calculation filters is that technically they cannot be applied to multiple worksheets, right? So with a regular filter like region, if I right-clicked and I said apply to worksheets, selected worksheets, I would get all these options of these different worksheets I could select and apply my filter to. But with my table calculation filter, there is no option to apply to other worksheets. So you might look at that and say, well, then why'd you even waste my time telling me about these things, you dork? Okay, well, back up. So it's true, you can't right click and say apply to other worksheets or, add to all data sources or whatever, all those options that come up. But what you could do, and what I have done before, is you could create a parameter which controls those. So for example, if I created a region parameter, I could have the region lookup on 3 different worksheets, and then whatever I select in the parameter updates, basically you'd have something here where you'd say, lookup max region 0 equals my lookup region parameter. I don't actually have that, but if I did, I could do that. Now I could throw this on all 3 of my worksheets, and then all 3 of them would update and filter in sync. So that's an option. If you're looking at this and you're like, I have no idea what just happened for the last 5 minutes, just forget it. Now you know a little bit about table calculation filters, and you can always come back and watch this later or check out some of the additional resources. Okay. We probably don't have time to handle this bonus section, but I just wanted to point something out to you, just so you know this exists, which is when you put multiple filters in a worksheet in Tableau, a lot of times people think the only options is only relevant values or all values in database, right? So if I had like a state filter and a city filter, if I click on Washington State, I don't want to see, Dallas show up because Dallas is in Texas. It's not practical. So a lot of times you would say only relevant values. If you have a lot of filters, though, if you have 3, 4, 5 filters, that can get you in trouble though, because then if you pick like, a specific product like HP 4000, and there were no sales in Seattle, now Seattle goes missing because you said only relevant values, and you're like, yikes, that's not exactly how I wanted that to work. So when you have filters on context, or if you ever create a hierarchy in the data pane, you have additional options for how you can restrict values to show up in your filters. Maybe let me just show you one example of this just so you know, right? So if I have category and subcategory on filters, if I select furniture from categories, I don't want to see, what would be something, machines. Machines is not furniture, at least in this data set, so I don't want to see that here. So I might go to subcategory and say only relevant values. So now I'm only seeing the subcategories related to the categories I've seen. So like I was saying though, where you can get yourself in trouble with that is, let's say you've got, yet another filter. So if I have customer name on my filters card, and if I filter it down to just Aaron Bergman, I'm only seeing 2 subcategories because he didn't buy anything from our other categories. But that's not really, I don't want that to get updated and messed up now. This is confusing now, right? I'm like, well, wait, why can't I see machines or something, right? Okay. So what I could do is add category to context, go to subcategory, and instead of saying only relevant values, say all values in context. So for the category filter, because that's on context, this is going to function very similar to only relevant values. But then this list doesn't get messed up and restricted because I picked Aaron Bergman from this list down below, right? So that's a way that you can control, hey, yeah, I do want this to respect some other filters, but there are also some filters I don't want it to be restricted by. So both adding filters to context, and then like I said, if you ever put things in a hierarchy, I guess let's just do it now. If I put state and region together in a hierarchy, and then I pick the central region, I would get an option here that would say all values in hierarchy, and now it's limiting this list, but it's only looking at what's in the hierarchy. So if I put customer name in here and I filter on Aaron Bergman, that doesn't mess up the list of states. It's still showing all the states in the central region. Okay, cool. I saw some questions come through. I will stay for a few minutes to answer those, but I also realized that we are pretty close to time here. So thank you for being a part of this. I hope this was really helpful just to be able to better understand all these different options that Tableau provides and in what order they work, because there's a lot of them, right? And unless you have years and years of experience, there's probably no way that you would have used all these and know how they all work. So if you ever have questions for us, here's our kind of general contact, my contact, Ollie, who's on the line, there's his contact. We would love to help you. As I've mentioned, we'll be sending out this recording and some related resources either later this week or sometime next week. So hopefully you'll have this to look back over. And I'm going to take a couple minutes here now to go back through the chat because I did see some questions come through in the last 15 minutes that I didn't have time to tackle in the moment. Okay. So if you have to leave now, thank you again for being here. It was awesome to have so many of you here. And if you can stick around for a few more minutes, I will tackle those questions. Okay. Yes. So, okay. So I see a couple of questions about context filters. So to maybe just briefly go back to those. Yeah. As far as functionality, your user will not know the difference between a context filter and a dimension filter. So you can show that and interact with that just the same. All the same types of things apply. So if I want to be able to hit the drop down on a context filter and say something like apply to other worksheets, same ability applies here. Okay. And we didn't really have a super practical use case for this, but let's do it now. If you wanted to add multiple filters to context, you could. So if I put corporate segment on here and I add that to context, then I can have two. That's not a problem. Actually, probably the most practical use case for this would be our fixed expressions, right? If I was to add, let's go with, I already have segment here, don't I? Okay, let's go with ship mode. If I put ship mode on here and I say, hey, I only want to look at first class shipping, I would want to make sure that that also is added to context to impact our fixed expression. Okay. So there's nothing holding you back from having multiple filters on context. The one practical consideration is just to be mindful of performance. If you add 5 or 10 filters to context, yeah, you might see a little bit of a performance drop off. I'd have to kind of go back and look at Tableau's documentation, but I think the idea of a context filter is that Tableau is sort of limiting the data. It's creating a contextual version of the data for the sheet that you're working in, which can be really nice, but that could also lead to some increased processing times if you have like a lot of these and they're changing super often. So it's just something to look out for and be careful of. It's not something I run into that often where I have to like change how I was approaching it, but it is good to know about and be aware of. Yeah. Okay, there's another question here. If you want the country filter without nulls as a filter on the dashboard, do you use the country set no nulls? No, actually, I would not use that. Yeah. So in this case here, we have our country filter. I would not show the set for this because the set where we slashed out the null, like it's actually going to show you that. So the whole point is we create the set, we exclude the null. I don't ever want my user to see that or interact with it. I just want them to be working with just my standard country filter now, where the null value is pre-filtered. Yep. Yeah, good question. Yeah. And I think I remember when that came through. Somebody mentioned that this would be a helpful video on its own. I think it was about the lookup region filter. Good news for you. We have one on that. So we'll send that out in the compilation of resources as well. Okay, that's everything that I see in the chat. I will stick around for just one more minute in case anything else comes through. But if it doesn't, again, thank you for being here. Thanks for staying here for a few extra minutes. And yeah, hopefully we'll catch you at another one of these webinars or a class or something really soon. Let me just put my contact info back on the screen one more time for anybody that could use the reminder. Actually, let me do this even. Let's put this back. For anybody that maybe wasn't here during the midsection, we've got classes. We do multiple classes every month. We can jump into an office hour with you. We can work with you end to end on a Tableau or data related project. There's my contact info. If you have any questions on that, just let me know. That's a great question, Sandra. Yeah, maybe Sandra, do you want to send me an email so I can follow up with you about a few videos I would recommend jumping off with and starting with? Because you're right, we've got like several hundred videos, and we've recently been talking about how do we organize these better? Like people can just find our videos one off, but I think we're talking about creating like a playlist that would be like, here's your beginner or intermediate or advanced playlist or calculations or whatever, and like work through it in this order. So I've got a couple that I can start you with, and then maybe you can help us and we can kind of create some playlists and you can give us some feedback on how it works. Yeah. Yeah, there's a question about, is there a video on only relevant values? Yes, we do have one like that. So let me write that down as something that we can include in the follow-up. And honestly, for a lot of these topics, if you just search like Tableau, OneNumber, then search the topic, fixed expressions, only relevant values, extracts, like even without our OneNumber name, it'll probably pop up pretty close to the top. But with that, you will find most of these. Yeah. Cool. Okay, everybody. Thanks again. This was fun. You know where to find me. You've got my email if you need anything, and you will hear from us in the next week with some additional resources. So have a great rest of your Tuesday, and yeah, talk to you soon.